As a rule, on Easter Sunday morning, we hear messages from ministers who preach on the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the viewpoint of the apostles who were handpicked by Jesus. This morning, you will hear this story from a different point of view. You will hear it from the lips of the man who was in charge of crucifying Christ. You will hear it from the lips of the Roman centurion at the cross. During my lifetime, I have watched a great many men die, both at my hands and at my side. How a man dies reveals who the man really is. My name is Julianus. I was a centurion in the Roman army, the greatest army on earth. I served under the greatest of the Caesars, Augustus and Tiberius. My life, however, was forever changed by an event which took place during the 19th year of Tiberius Caesar's reign. It is that event of which I wish to speak to you today. Listen to me carefully. After many years of bloody service in the border regions of our great empire, I had been assigned to the imperial troops under Pontius Pilate, then governor of Judea. I was stationed at his headquarters in the town called Caesarea by the Mediterranean Sea. As was his practice each year, Pilate moved his headquarters from Caesarea to Jerusalem at the time the Jews held their Passover feast. At that time, Jews from all over Palestine and even remote parts of the empire thronged to Jerusalem in order to celebrate their greatest of Jewish holidays. And the throngs of people usually brought trouble with them. It was there in Jerusalem that I saw a man called Jesus die. The Jewish leaders said he was just a nobody from the small town of Nazareth in Galilee province. But the way that he died was like the death of no other man I have ever witnessed. I know because I was the centurion on duty the day of his trial and execution. From very close proximity, I witnessed all that happened. Many times before, I had stood guard, observing men on trial before Pilate. I listened to Pilate interrogate them all. When faced with the death penalty, they all put on a show of complete sincerity and declared their utter innocence. To hear them say it, we Romans have never crucified a guilty man. But the Galilean from Nazareth made no protest at all. It was very early in the morning when the temple security guards first brought Jesus in, leading him from the dungeon of Caiaphas, the high priest. It was obvious that the prisoner had been awake all night. The night had been cold, and the prisoner had been severely mistreated. The Jewish leaders were accusing him of leading their nation astray, saying that he forbid them to pay taxes to Caesar and that he himself claimed to be the king of the Jews. All Pilate could get Jesus to say was that his kingdom did not originate from this world. So Pilate declared he could find no fault in Jesus. But then, learning Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee province, he sent him to Herod Antipas, the ruler of that province, who also was in town for the festival. Pilate figured Antipas could settle the bothersome matter for him. Actually, Herod Antipas only wanted to be entertained. He desired to see Jesus just to watch him do a magic trick or two. But Jesus stood silent and wouldn't perform in Herod's court, even when Herod and his cronies ridiculed him and made fun of him by dressing him in a gaudy robe and pretending that he was a king. Eventually, they tired of this diversion and sent him back to Pilate. Now, it was obvious that Pilate wanted to release Jesus, but the Jewish leaders, they kept insisting that he be condemned to death. They stirred up the crowds to force Pilate's hand. They let Pilate know in no uncertain terms that they were prepared to report him to Tiberius Caesar, to report that he, Pontius Pilate, was willing to allow a Roman menace, a self-professed king, go free in Palestine, a perennially rebellious part of the empire. Pilate knew he dare not risk raising the ire of Tiberius Caesar, and thus, against his will, he condemned Jesus to be whipped mercilessly and then crucified. Yet through it all, the Galilean from Nazareth remained silent. Now, Roman law may be cruel, but it is fair and impartial. I was surprised that Jesus made no protest. Again, without uttering a sound, he bore cruel and humiliating mocking, this time at the hands of my soldiers. You see, I was assigned responsibility for his scourging and crucifixion. As we whipped him, and his back was shredded by the bits of metal and bone dangling from the end of the whips, I felt sure that his screams of protest would surely begin. I had never seen a man bear the many-tailed whip in total silence. But in response to the lashing strokes of the whip, we heard only the hiss of his labored breathing. Again, he silently bore our mockery as my men and I continued to amuse ourselves at his expense. Even when we twisted some wicked thorns into a makeshift crown and jammed it down on his head, he did not try to resist. The blood trickled down his forehead, but his lips uttered no complaint. I began to feel drawn to this unusual prisoner. He was already too weak to carry his own cross all the way to the execution site. He fell down repeatedly until we relieved him of his burden and forced a passerby to carry it for him. Still, he endured the desperate death march to the place called the skull without uttering a word of protest. At the execution site, I supervised as the men under my command stretched out his arms on the crossbeam and hammered the long spikes through his hands. Still, not a word of protest came from his lips. Onto the upright cross they hefted the crossbeam bearing Jesus and set it in position. Still, not a word of protest came from his lips. Then my soldiers spiked his feet to the post, and there he hung before us, his face etched with excruciating pain. It was then that my eyes met his eyes directly for the first time. His eyes searched me. From his eyes radiated no hatred, no, none whatsoever. From his eyes radiated only compassion and even love. Then Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Suddenly, a scene I had witnessed many times before forcefully arrested my thoughts. I had been accompanying Pilate to Jerusalem at the Passover festival for several years. Our quarters were in the fortress of Antonia, built against one wall of the Jewish temple. From our towers high above the wall, we looked down and kept tabs on all the activities in the temple court. I had seen literally thousands of Passover lambs slain and their blood sloshed against the altar. I'd always marveled at how a lamb died. There was never any protest. Silently, they faced the slaughter. And that was how this man was dying, like a Passover lamb. Pilate had been right in his assessment of Jesus. Then I do not know what possessed me, but I shouted right out loud, "Truly, this is a righteous man." But something else about the way he died stood out as different from the way other men died. Every other man I had watched be crucified fought and struggled to stay alive, but this man was willingly giving his life away. All during the trial, I had had this strange feeling that Pilate was unable to bring the situation under his control. The priests and bloodthirsty crowd were in the grips of raging anger and unreasoned hostility. It seemed that the prisoner alone was under control. Beside him, his Jewish accusers acted like animals, obsessed with making the kill. Pilate and Herod, those supposedly sovereign rulers over their realm, were both frustrated and confused. Neither one got what he wanted. Only Jesus stood calm, quiet, and assured. He acted like a man in charge of his own destiny. The feeling I had about this Galilean grew ever stronger at the place of the skull where we crucified him. By the time he had hung on the cross nearly 3 hours, it had grown into an irresistible force within me. It was then, at the very middle of the day, when the sun was at its highest, that an odd sort of darkness began to fall over the land. The noisy crowd of gawkers became subdued, awed by the eerie darkness. I moved closer to the crosses in order to perform my duty. I must not allow his followers to snatch him from me in the gloom of that menacing midday night. I moved ever closer to the cross. Only I was close enough to study Jesus' face. Then I heard him. I saw him lift his eyes toward heaven. And he shouted out, "It is finished. He used a word I had never heard before at an execution site. I'd heard it many times in the marketplace. It meant simply the debt is paid in full. He made it sound like a victory shout, not a cry of defeat. Then his voice rang clear. Father, no. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I saw intense anguish on his face. Someone thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah and brought him a drink of sour wine soaked into a sponge. Then Jesus lifted up his head up high and shouted, "It is finished." He used a word I had heard hundreds of times before in business transactions, but never at an execution. It meant simply the debt is paid in full. He made it sound like a victory shout, not a cry of defeat. Then one final time his voice rang clear. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Then his head slumped over and he died. I was astonished. Sometimes men hang for days on a cross before they die, but this man seemed to know that he'd suffered enough, and then he simply willed to die, and he died. I began to realize that I had not really been in charge of his execution at all. He had been in charge all along. But immediately my thoughts were interrupted. The earth began to shake with the violence of a great earthquake. I swayed dizzily on my feet. A great flush of fear washed over me. The men under my command moved in close beside me. I felt the trembling of stark terror in them as they pressed against my sides. They, too, realized that the Galilean from Nazareth was no ordinary man. I put words to our common thought and said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." They all grunted their agreement. Then I heard one say, "I have never seen a man die like this man." Believe you me, my lips were trained to acknowledge no God except the emperor. But at that point, they acknowledged that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God. Then, just as quickly as it had fallen, the darkness suddenly lifted, and the sun shone full upon us again. Yet a pall still hung over the execution site. Jesus' limp, lifeless body hung there on the cross, his head slumped forward against his chest. The crowds began to melt away. Some left beating their chests as if to drive sadness from their hearts. I stepped back and took a long look at Jesus hanging there in the bright sunlight. A strong sense of shame swept over me, a sense of shame such as I have never felt in my life before. It was as if he ought to have been the one standing, and I ought to have been the one hanging there dead on that cross. His death was like the death of no other man I've ever witnessed. He died like an innocent sacrificial lamb. He died like the Son of God. But soon, I was to learn that his death was like the death of no other man in another and even more startling way. Pilate sent soldiers to tell us that the Jews wanted the 3 condemned men killed and their bodies taken down from the crosses before the Jewish Sabbath began at sundown. It was standard practice to hurry along the death of crucified men by breaking their legs. Then they could no longer push themselves up in order to breathe, and within a short time they would suffocate and die. But when the soldiers came to Jesus, they were amazed to find that he was already dead. One of them savagely jabbed his spear into Jesus' side. Blood and water gushed out of the gaping hole, silent witnesses to the fact that Jesus was indeed already dead. A messenger came to summon me before Pilate. A wealthy Jew named Joseph of Arimathea had asked for the body of Jesus for burial. And Pilate wanted to know if it was really true that Jesus was already dead. I assured Pilate that he was, but could tell Pilate was surprised. He then granted the body of Jesus to the wealthy Jew for burial. With my duties completed, I returned to the fortress of Antonia. My mind was reeling from all the experiences of the day. Now I had been in charge of the execution of more men than I could remember, and I had never missed a single night's sleep. But that night, I tossed and turned on my mat. I could not get the Galilean from Nazareth out of my mind. The next day was the Jewish Sabbath. It was a quiet day compared to the one before. I was again on duty, standing guard in Pilate's presence, when the chief priests of the Jews came to see him again. Now, I was thoroughly surprised to see them on the Sabbath day. Whatever they wanted had to be doubly important for them to come to see the governor on their holy day. The priests said to Pilate, "Governor, while the impostor king was still alive, he made this claim: after 3 days pass, I will rise up again. Therefore, we want you to give orders for the gravesite to be made secure until after 3 days have passed. We think his disciples may come, steal the body, and then announce to the people, 'Look, he's no longer in the grave. He has risen from the dead.' If they succeed, this latter deception will be worse than the former." Now it was obvious that Pilate had had his fill of the Jesus matter. He had washed his hands of it once already. He scornfully told the priests to take guards and make the gravesite as secure as they liked. So with Pilate's approval, the priests went and posted guards at the burial site. They also placed a seal on the large round stone blocking the entrance to the tomb. After that, everything was quiet in Jerusalem until just before dawn on the first day of the week. As I lay dozing fitfully on my mat, the fortress of Antonia was suddenly rocked by a severe earthquake. I feared for my life, but the fortress is built of huge stone blocks and stood firm through the shaking. Immediately, my mind snapped back to the earthquake which occurred at the time Jesus died. I could no longer sleep, so I arose and began my day. That evening, I resolved to fortify myself against another sleepless night by drinking a bit more than my usual consumption of wine. I visited a tavern where our soldiers would congregate. As the evening wore on, I observed that several members of the guard were present. They seemed to have plenty of money and were drinking excessively. One of them was the captain of the guard, I knew him quite well and managed to get him aside into a quiet corner. The wine had loosened his tongue so that he spoke freely. He told me he had been in charge of a squad of soldiers specially assigned to guard the tomb of Jesus. At the outset, they had joked about Jesus' spineless disciples who deserted him at the time of his arrest. If they wouldn't risk their lives for him while he was still alive, how could anyone think they would do so after he was dead? It was ridiculous. They laughed about how dangerous this assignment was. To guard the tomb of a dead man. Dead men don't escape. That was their attitude until the wee hours of the morning just before dawn. It was then that the earthquake struck. Simultaneously, a shining angel appeared, rolling away the stone from the tomb and then sitting down upon it. The guards were unnerved by the earthquake and then terrified by the appearance of the angel. They wanted to run, but their knees buckled. They fell to the ground and lay there like men slain in battle. As they lay on the ground, cringing in fear, 2 women who had been devout followers of Jesus came to the tomb. The angel spoke to them and said, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are seeking Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen from the grave. Come and see the place where he lay, and then go and tell his disciples that Jesus is alive. He has come back from the dead." When the women and the angel had gone, the captain of the guard finally mustered up enough courage to approach the entrance to the tomb. He peered inside. He found it empty. The angel had been right. There was no corpse present. The cocoon of wrappings which had surrounded Jesus' body, however, was there, hollow and sunken in, but otherwise undisturbed. It looked as if the body had simply evaporated right out of it. Haunted by fear, the guards hustled into the city and timidly reported to the chief priests what they had seen. The chief priests excitedly talked the situation over and then counted out a substantial sum of money to each of the guards, instructing them to say that while they slept, Jesus' disciples had come and stolen his body. It was then that it struck me. The Galilean's death was most radically different from the death of all other men in that he refused to stay in the grave. Now, I am not by nature, nor by training, a religious man. I have known in my lifetime no other allegiance than to our reigning Roman emperor and his sword. But this humble man from Nazareth is greater than all the Caesars. No Caesar has ever risen from the dead. Surely Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God. Though I do not understand all it means, I know I must give him my highest allegiance and serve only him. We do not know what happened to this Roman centurion who looked upon the face of Christ on the cross and declared, truly, this man was the Son of God. Such is the conclusion he came to from watching Jesus die. And it is this conclusion that is of great importance to us today. But what is of even greater importance is the conclusion that we individually draw about this one who died on that cross 2,000 years ago. Have you too, like the centurion, recognized that he died like the Son of God? Have you too recognized that he rose again from the dead and desires to grant you infinite life? He's the only one who can do that because his death alone is sufficient to cover the penalty that you and I owe for our sin. Have you too recognized that he died in your place? Have you received him as your substitute and Savior? Have you too given him your ultimate, your highest allegiance? If not, why not do it today? And then your life too can be forever changed.